Hello and welcome to another short video which is aiming to get you the top grades on each character of an Inspector Calls. We're looking at the Inspector. As usual, we'll start off with the grade sort of 6 to 7 idea. Then we'll build on that with the grade 7 political socialist message. We'll look for the grade 7 and grade 8 links between Christianity and socialism at the time. And then we'll show how the Inspector proves this is much more an anti-war play than just an anti-capitalist play. And that's grade 8 and 9 stuff, which is why it will need more than one slide. Another grade 8 idea is how the Inspector carries Priestley's feminist message. You might not have thought of this as a feminist play. We'll see how the play works as a literary allusion, another grade 8 idea, and in this case to Scrooge in Dickens' A Christmas Carol. And then we'll look at Priestley's great enemy, Winston Churchill, and how he uses the Inspector to get his revenge. So the first thing you're going to write about if you have an essay on the Inspector, or actually on any character because the Inspector will be involved, is to use this word, proxy. The Inspector is a proxy for Priestley's views. That means he represents, he carries Priestley's views. He's a proxy. The simple part of his message is delivered just before he leaves, the Inspector. But just remember this, one Eva Smith has gone, but there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us, with their lives, their hopes and fears, their suffering and chance of happiness, all intertwined with our lives and what we think and say and do. So this, of course, is his socialist message, that we must all be responsible for each other, and that's what you get from the white, and that we have to be responsible for those who are disadvantaged, the workers, and that's the bit in yellow. We can clearly see how he takes Eva Smith to represent not just working class women, but also working class men. And so the Inspector represents the interests of all the working classes. So he is a socialist character on the side of the working classes because he's a proxy for Priestley's views. Let's consider a little more deeply how that makes him a socialist. So his socialist message is that we are intertwined with everyone and so have a responsibility to the working classes in their millions and millions and millions. Don't forget that third million because it really emphasises just how many working class people they are, and that stands in contrast to the audience. In the audience at the theatre, you'd basically have upper and middle class people, people with the leisure time to be interested in theatre, which the working classes probably wouldn't. I mean, I know that's a generalisation, but you get the idea. And then we have this idea that we don't live alone, we are members of one body. Now that is there to contrast with Burling's view that every man has to look after himself and his family. That's the quotation you want to contrast it with. We are responsible for each other. And this responsibility doesn't just mean that we've got to be careful about how we react to other people, we also have to help them. Well, just as today there would be lots of voters, lots of members of the audience who would be suspicious of socialism. They don't trust it. They prefer a capitalist system. So Priestley uses the Inspector in a cunning way. He says, well, don't just see this as a socialist play. I also want you to see it as a Christian play because 80% of his audience would have been deeply Christian. And if Priestley can make a link saying that actually socialism is really the same as Jesus' message in the Bible, it's really the same as Christianity, then he can win more of his audience over. And that's why he gives the Inspector this language. When the Inspector says, we are members of one body, this is a deliberate echo of the communion. This is the service that happens in church where the congregation drink red wine in commemoration of Jesus' blood, and they eat bread in commemoration of his body. And this all comes from Jesus at the Last Supper. Now, what you need to know is that this language is instantly recognisable because it is Christian language that comes from the communion service. And therefore, It's a direct Christian message. The biblical allusion would be obvious to the audience. This links Priestley's socialist message that we are all responsible for each other to the Christian message, which even the most anti-socialist capitalist will already accept in Christian teaching. So this is much more persuasive than simple politics. It tells his audience that the only moral Christian society must also be a socialist society, and therefore you must vote for one. And remember, 1945 is the year of the election. This is a campaigning play. Now, it's very easy to forget that this is an anti-war play because we're living in peaceful times. But of course, this is being performed right at the end of the Second World War in Europe. Everybody's thinking about the Second World War. But of course, the World War is still going on in Asia and Japan. Japan's not surrendered yet. So it's being performed in a country that is still at war. And these are the inspector's words. And it's important they're his final words, because this is Priestley's way of saying they're his most important words. That's why I'm saving them till last. And I tell you that the time will soon come when if men will not learn that lesson, then they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. Good night. So the prediction of fire and blood and anguish is clearly a description of both world wars, the one that the audience has just lived through and the one that his characters are going to live through. Remember, it's set in 1912 and the First World War happens just 2 years later in 1914. So Priestley's making a direct link between capitalism and the desire for war. He's saying that the very people who rule society because they're greedy and want profit and money are the same people who might want war. How do we know they want war? Well, they led us into the First World War, which was supposed to end all wars. It was so horrifying. But there we are, just 20 years later in 1939, fighting a Second World War. This is intolerable, is what the inspector's message is, but it's also a consequence of giving power to capitalist men. Well, let's jump into the grade 9 idea about how capitalism equals war. So Priestley is pointing out that war is an economic consequence of capitalism. Now, what that means is capitalism's desire is to make as much profit as possible, and one way to do that is to start a war. So the lesson is that in order to expand markets and defeat competition, Britain will go to war against its main economic rival, Germany. So by the time that Priestley was writing, in fact before that, at the time of the First World War, Germany now had a greater slice of world trade than Britain for the first time ever. And so Germany was a massive economic rival. Well, how do you destabilize and attack an economic rival? Well, what better way than through a war? Now, this had devastating consequences for the upper classes, because whereas the soldiers would all go into the trenches, their officers would share their life with them, but also the officers would be the first up, leading the charge. And where did the officer class come from? Well, it came from the sons of the capitalists. It was the Erics of Britain who were first up out of the trenches and therefore suffered more casualties than the working class. So what Priestley's pointing out here is that capitalism is willing to sacrifice their own sons in order for profit. And this is how he's appealing to the middle class men in the audience. You know, he's saying that your own parents, unwittingly perhaps, they wouldn't admit it to themselves, are actually willing to sacrifice your life in order to do very well out of the economic business of war. Because who is going to earn all the money from providing the uniforms, building the tanks? Well, obviously it's going to be businesses like the Burlings and Crofts. These are men who are going to grow rich out of warfare. Right, because this is 1945, Priestley has also written a very early feminist play. And he's on the side of women because most people in his audience would be female. Many of the men would still be in Europe, in the army. And the other thing that's happened is that over 1 million women have suddenly got jobs for the first time because the men weren't there to fill them. And so suddenly we've got this massive flourishing of female empowerment where not only are they free from control by men, but they also have financial independence from going to these jobs. And they don't want to lose these jobs as soon as the men come back. Now, a capitalist society is very likely to boot the women out of these jobs and let the men go back into them. That's what happened after the First World War. But a socialist society is going to care for everybody and will be much more careful about keeping women in jobs. So that's why the inspector talks about men in this quotation. If men will not learn, that they'll learn that lesson. Yeah, he doesn't talk about man or mankind. He actually means males, because this is a feminist play. The inspector's appealing directly to Priestley's female audience and inviting them to see war as a male idea. So voting for socialism will also reject Churchill, the great wartime prime minister. And so you can imagine most people at the time thought that it would be a walk-in for Churchill. He's just won the war. So obviously we'll get a conservative government. But astonishingly, in 1945, the feminist message was strong enough and the socialist message was strong enough to get rid of probably our greatest hero at the time. And this is extraordinary when we look back on it. Churchill was arguably the most popular prime minister Britain had ever had. But he was forever identified with war. And because this is an anti-war play, and the mood at the time would have been so anti-war, it was a way for socialism to triumph by rejecting war. So like Priestley, his female audience rejected war, and Labour won by a landslide victory. And in fact, even since 1945, there's never been a bigger victory for a political party. Now, it's also useful for you to consider the inspector in performance. So when I read out that final quotation, I tried to do it in quite an angry way, and that might not come across when you just read it on the page. And so it's interesting to watch the play in performance. On the page, the inspector's reference to a lesson makes this seem quite calm. As the teacher, so the inspector takes the role of the teacher, he's made his point, and the death of Eric's partner and son has had a powerful impact on the Burlings. Eric is brooding, while Sheila is quietly crying, and we can use those stage directions to prove what an impact his last words have had. However, in performance, this scene can be portrayed with outrage and quite aggressive anger, and the clue is the front door slam, which is the last sound of the act. Bang! You see what I mean? It's horrible, but we don't notice that when it's just on the page. So the front door slam, and apologies again, is Priestley's proxy for his great anger. Right, he also wants to have a literary allusion, and he chooses a text that everyone in his audience will know very well. It's Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, and he's interested in the character of Scrooge, who represents the Burlings here. And then the inspector, as the ghoul ghost, represents the ghost of Christmas yet to come. He is the ghost who teaches Scrooge what the future is going to be like and persuades Scrooge finally to change his ways. And that's exactly the message that the inspector has in this play. It's now important to consider why Priestley makes the inspector leave at this point. He doesn't leave at the end, he gives them time on stage on their own. And that's because it's important that the family be allowed to exercise their free will and choose to learn the inspector's lesson or reject it. In A Christmas Carol, Scrooge famously learns the lesson, and it ends happily. But Priestley turns that on its head, and he has Gerald and the two Burling parents refuse to accept the lesson. So this is exactly in the tradition of A Christmas Carol, a text Priestley wants his audience to bear in mind. As you know, ghoul is a clear reminder of ghost, and therefore a clear allusion to Dickens' The Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come. When this ghost leaves Scrooge, Scrooge is also free to learn the lesson, that we are all responsible for each other. It's the same lesson. Scrooge does learn it, and the future is altered, and as a result, this is crucial, the character Bob Cratchit who in the alternative future shown by the ghost dies, actually lives because Scrooge has changed the future by changing himself. And this idea of the ending giving us this possibility of death or life to a character is one that Priestley deliberately steals with Eva. So if the family change their mind and learn the inspector's lesson, the implication is that Eva will live, like Bob Cratchit does. But if they don't learn the lesson, then Eva will die, like Bob Cratchit does in that alternative future. And he's not just stealing this idea in a sneaky way, he's doing it in a really obvious way because he wants his audience to make this connection. He's saying, look, this is a story you already know. You already know how it should end. It should end happily, as Scrooge's story did, but it hasn't ended happily. It's ended in world wars for us. So similarly, Priestley wants us to understand that if the family learn the same lesson, Eva will live, and there will be no second inspector calling. Now, Priestley had no love for Winston Churchill, not just because of his politics, and not just because he was so successful at war in a way, but also because Churchill got him sacked from the BBC. Priestley had the #1 radio show in the country in 1941. It was huge. It was as big as Bake Off and Strictly added together in terms of the audience that it had. Everybody in the country virtually tuned into him. And Churchill said to the BBC, "I don't really like this man's socialist message. Can you sack him?" And the BBC did. And that's another historical example of how the upper classes simply had too much power. Now, Priestley's point is that in 1912, if the family had learnt their lesson, and they represent the upper classes, we wouldn't even have had the First World War, never mind the Second World War. The play is a further chance for the lesson to be learned by the audience, because his message to them is, look, unless we change our politics and our rulers, there will be World War #3. And so the political purpose of the play isn't just to have a socialist government, it is to prevent World War III. Priestley then went on to found CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, in order to stop World War III destroying the world. And that was Priestley's main political purpose. He actually stood for the election in 1945, but not as a member of the Labour Party. And so you can use that autobiographical detail to show how important it was to Priestley not just to create a socialist society, but actually to create a future free of war. Now, the best way to use my video is to go back and take notes from all the screens. You might not want to trawl all the way through it, so I will just put each screen up now so you can just pause and reflect on it without spending too long having to look for them. This is a brilliant way to learn. You can make brief notes. You don't have to write everything that's on my slides. You'll just make brief notes on them. A lot of it you will already know, of course, because you've been studying hard. Use these to make revision cards, and you will get grade 7 easily, because grade 7 is just knowing stuff, and grade 8 and 9 is how you apply it to talk about Priestley's point of view. So, as usual, thank you so much for subscribing. See you soon on my channel. Good luck in your exams.